No, when I first came to Texas Instruments, my wife had just driven from University of Pennsylvania. In fact, I didn't graduate from the University of Pennsylvania. I had to pay for somebody else to stand in line for me to graduate because I wanted to go to work. I wanted to get to Texas Instruments. And I arrived, and TI was growing at 30% a year. 1 out of every 3 employees was brand new. And TI had just developed the first transistor. And so it was boom time for them. And I was herded into this room with about 300 other people, the orientation seminar. And we were handed a piece of paper. And basically what the paper said was any idea we had 24/7 belonged to Texas Instruments. And there were about 7 or 8 people that raised their hand and said, "Sir, I can't sign this document. I mean, I have a small business of my own. I can't, everything I think of and do, I can't, you can't." Oh, he says, "The door's over there. Either join us or get out." Of course, I signed the paper. We just traveled halfway across the country with 2 little children. My wife's in the Dallas County Motel, Dallas, I forgot what the name of the motel was. In Richardson, but it was called the Dallas Motel. And it was about 105 degrees. This was the end of May. We had an early summer. And we only had 1 car. And so she's locked in the hotel with 2 wild babies. And I'm trying to get everything set at TI and make sure that we're going to get started. Well, I'd heard there was this guy, Jack Kilby, who'd invented the integrated circuit. But he was in a big huff because TI had given him a nice shiny dollar bill for his patent. That was his reward. And so he left. He left in a huff. Management thought about it for a few days and realized that, of course, Kilby had developed something that was going to be worth billions of dollars, actually trillions of dollars now. And so they offered to hire him back as a consultant at $100,000 a year, which at that time was real money. I mean, real money. But with the condition that he not work for anybody else and that so he was still, all of his ideas would be owned by Texas Instruments. And he was also required to supply 2 to 3 ideas a year, come up with 2 or 3 ideas a year for TI to evaluate. The next time I interacted with Jack was he had submitted of course I drew the short straw. I got to evaluate one of his ideas. And his idea was to build solar panels for houses made out of gallium arsenide. Gallium arsenide is a 3,5 compound. Not silicon is an element, but gallium and arsenic are 2 different elements, and when you bring them together, you call it a 3,5 compound. It's also a semiconductor, very high-speed electrons. Well, I took Jack's idea seriously. I decided to study it a little bit, and I found out the only source of gallium was aluminum production, and the only source of arsenic is from copper. It's a byproduct of copper mining. And there isn't enough gallium arsenide in the world to populate 1 city with rooftops, these tiles of gallium. So I gave a very discouraging report about Jack's idea. And he came over to see me about it because obviously management was unhappy. They thought maybe he's just flipping them some ideas and he hadn't actually looked into it. But we talked for a little while, and he was actually a pretty friendly guy. But he also seemed to be very, what's the right word, disgruntled about the fact that, of course, the semiconductor industry had become a multi-billion-dollar industry, and $100K a year was not exactly the kind of return on the investment that he'd expected. There was also another fellow. He was at Intel. His name was Robert Noyce. Robert Noyce had also invented the integrated circuit. In fact, Robert Noyce had actually developed a working integrated circuit. And he patented it before Jack Kilby. However, Kilby's patent had been written in a notebook with a date on it before Noyce had submitted his patent. So TI and Intel fought with the government for about 20 years over who would get the patent. And the government finally gave up and gave it to both of them. And the next time I interacted with Jack Kilby was in 1991, I think. I was at a company called the Semiconductor Research Corporation in North Carolina. And our president wanted to make sure that, I think it was President Clinton, it was President Clinton, to nominate us as one of the most exciting young companies. And they found out that I knew Jack Kilby. So they wanted me to get Jack Kilby to write a letter of recommendation for us. So I called Kilby on the phone, and he said, Truman, whatever, but I'm not writing the letter. You write it, and you send it to me, email it to me, and I'll mark it up and send it back to you. And so I wrote this letter, started out with I, Jack Kilby, co-inventor of the integrated circuit, highly recommend semiconductor research technique. And I went on a little bit. I made it pretty flowery and stuff that I thought Jack said a lot of nice things about Jack Kilby too, which I thought he would have no trouble signing it. Well, indeed, he sent it right back to me the next day, except for one change. He crossed out the co. He wanted to make sure everybody knew he was the inventor of the integrated circuit. Well, Robert Noyce went on to become the president of a company called Microelectronic Circuit Corporation. When we were fighting the Japanese, we needed to have a national corporation to address this Japanese threat. Just as a side, I gave tours to the Japanese when I was starting out at Texas. They were our best customers. We had no idea that they would ever compete with us. In fact, after World War II, anything Japan made, we called Jap crap. I mean, they're just making thousands of different things, but it was all junk. And of course, they were our best customer. We sure didn't want them to buy transistors from Motorola or Fairchild, those evil guys. So Truman, show them everything. And when they came to visit, they came with their fancy cameras. I want to show them all the slides you've got. They want to look through the microscopes. They want to see each stage of the lab. We gave the technology to them. We later ended up suing Japan. In fact, TI would make anywhere between $200 and $300 million a year on patent violations from Japan. Intel, Bob Noyce's company, was a lot more clever. Everything was trade secret. They did no patents. They knew that everything was going to be stolen, so they always decided to invest heavily in research to stay one step ahead. In fact, Texas Instruments, when Intel came out with their 16-bit microprocessor, TI had this leapfrog program to catch up with Intel. And we were going to use our fancy military processor, and oh, we were so proud of ourselves. And we had this package that had 22 electric pins, whereas Intel only had 16 pins. And we made a big deal out of that, how we had 22 pins, which could do all this other stuff. You could hook up this volt, you could hook up this process, and so on. The day after we announced our product, Intel announced their 64K RAM. And the reason they used 16 pins is because it would be upward compatible with the 64K. And here we're stuck with about a $100 billion loss right off. We were not very clever with our marketing.